Hi, I'm John Knoll, software trainer for Adobe, and today we'll be talking all about color in Premiere Pro. All right, here we are inside our sample project. Now, before I start working with color, I want to change the workspace here to activate all of my color panels. Much like other software, there's a dedicated color workspace here in Premiere Pro that will activate all the tools. This is similar to the color workspace option in Avid or the color tab in DaVinci Resolve, but the idea is the same. It's just a dedicated interface for working with color. So I'm going to go up to Window, Workspaces, and select Color. And this does two things. It opens up the Lumetri color panel over here on the right, as well as our scopes. Now we'll dive into the Lumetri panel here in a moment, but I just want to explain the rest of the interface. So Lumetri itself is actually an effect. If we were to look here in the effects palette and go down here to video effects and color correction, we see Lumetri right there. And when we could always just drag and drop that onto a clip from the effects panel. But we don't even have to do that. With the Lumetri panel open, all you do is touch one slider and the effect is automatically added to the clip. You don't have to do anything else. You don't have to pull it here from the effects library. And I'll show you here in effects controls, when we click on this clip, Lumetri is indeed applied right there. I'm going to remove that instance for now. Just hit delete and go back. Pull up my color project. There we go. Now, unlike Avid, you won't see the previous, current, and next frame viewers up here. You can, however, turn on this option called comparison view. I'm going to go into a couple of clips from a short film here. This is from the same scene, and I want to compare these two shots with each other in the program monitor. And we have a dedicated button down here called comparison view. You can see it right there. If you don't see that button, by the way, just click on the button editor and drag it down from this tray. But by turning on comparison view, I can look at other shots in the sequence. I just go by time code or just use this quick slider to find that shot. And now as I color correct the right-hand side, I can see how it compares to another shot already in the sequence there. This is the side-by-side view. I can also split them vertically or split them horizontally if I want to see that type of comparison. Now, scopes have their own dedicated panel. It usually opens right behind the source monitor. Now, you can leave it in that position, or you can pull it off and put it somewhere else, make your own custom workspace if you want to see other panels next to it, or just leave it there and move it into position like so. There's a vector scope, histogram, parade, and waveform, similar to the quad display option that you know from Avid. Or you can choose just one scope at a time. You can do that by clicking on the wrench down here or just right-clicking right there in the scopes viewer. You can turn off the ones you don't want to see here. So in this case, I'll get rid of the vector scope and the parade and just look at the histogram and waveform together. Or I can just look at the histogram by itself, for example. There are presets in here for different scope configurations. All right, so it's looking at the parade there. And I can choose different options for those as well. So if I go to parade type, I can change that from RGB to YUV, for example. Or the waveform type, just look at things as luma values instead of RGB values. So all those are found here under the wrench, and it will automatically choose the color space for you. So if you know you're definitely working in Rec 709, you can set that. Or if you were definitely working in HDR color space, you can set that up. And the scopes will reflect that accordingly. And down here, you can see you can work here in 10-bit, float, or HDR. And there's even options in here to reduce the brightness of the scopes or increase the brightness depending on how you like to view them. Just leave that set here for normal. Now let's talk about the color settings in Premiere Pro. There's been many changes made in the last few versions to simplify and consolidate all the color settings for displaying clips properly, especially when they're in different color spaces like log or HDR. So the color settings in Premiere Pro, which were previously scattered across several panels and preferences, have now been consolidated in the Settings tab next to the Edit tab in the Lumetri Color panel. Starting at the top here, we have our main preferences, and we can enable things like display color management and extended dynamic range monitoring. And then below that, there's a quick shortcut to change the transmit option to an external monitor. In this case, I have a Blackmagic card hooked up, so that video stream is on. There's settings there for the production or the project. In this case, I have a production open right now. This would say project instead of production there. Settings for the source clip and for the sequence. So how do these all work together? I have two example sequences here. This one has a log clip, and this one has a series of HDR clips here. You can see that those are very blown out. This is pretty typical of iPhone footage now. Most of them shoot HDR by default, and you'll get this kind of look when you first bring a clip into Premiere Pro. So in order to clean both of these up, we can change a few of the color settings. So starting here at the top, display color management ensures consistent color management across all your applications and whatever screen you happen to be using. It works with the monitor profile that you have to try to basically ensure that you've got the best possible representation of the color and the contrast of your image, so that when you start grading, you're doing it from the same baseline level, essentially. And then below that, we have extended dynamic range monitoring. We're going to turn that on. Let me go over to the HDR timeline. All right, so you can see that that starts to clean up that image a little bit. And let me go ahead and turn on the scopes so we can see what's happening here. All right, and then in the production settings, let me flip back to that log clip. Now here under viewer gamma, we now have options to change the way that the program monitor looks. Right now, the viewer gamma is set to 2.4, which is broadcast. You can set that to preview for the web, which is 2.2, or, and this is new, 1.96, which is the gamma standard for the QuickTime player in Mac OS. And that's been a consistent issue where people will output color-corrected projects from Premiere Pro, send it to someone who loads it in QuickTime player, and it looks different from what the output was on the original Premiere system. And this allows you to preview that without adding any LUTs. None of these will add a LUT or affect the output in any way. It's simply a way to preview different color gammas right here in the program monitor, so you get more of a sense of what your client might be seeing on their end. Let me change that back to broadcast. Below that, we have the option to auto-detect log color space, and watch what happens to the image on screen. So with that auto-detect log switch on, it detects that this is indeed log color space, and it pushes it back towards a normal looking image, kind of removes that washed out log look without having to add a color effect or a LUT to it. If you click on a clip in the timeline, you can override the input LUT for a source clip. Here we see that it was captured with Canon Log 3, and it's using that color space. We can apply a LUT right there. There's a LUT dropdown, or you can override that color space and apply a different color space like so, which kind of brings us back to where we were, or we leave that back to the media color space there. There's also color settings for the sequence itself. This color space is set to Rec 709. If I wanted to grade in HDR, I could choose from one of those two options in there. And let me switch back over here to the HDR timeline, which we can see that that clip is pretty washed out here. We're losing the whites because this is an HDR clip, but it's in a Rec 709 color space there. And we can see here from the scopes that it's clipping the whites here at the top. But we have the ability to auto tone map media. This is a switch for the sequence. If I turn that on, and I get that warning there, I say OK. And see how it brought down all the highlights so that they're no longer blown out. We picked up a little more detail there. We can see that that cleaned up on the scopes a little bit and gave us a broader color spectrum to work with there. And if I was to change that back to HLG, I go back and I could grade this in HDR or keep it as Rec 709. And we'll kind of clamp down on those colors so they're not blown out. Setting auto tone map media on, especially if you're going to stay in the Rec 709 color space for output, is really, really important for your HDR footage, especially anything from an iPhone, like as I mentioned, that they typically shoot in HDR now. So to get the proper color and to get the proper Rec 709 signal out of that HDR footage, you want to turn on auto tone map media. And you can override it for individual clips as well. So down here you have a sequence clip option, and there's different ways to do the tone mapping. So you see there's hue preservation, which says it's good for iPhone HDR. Let me go back to this first clip here. And you can play around with it there. There's also an option for log video and for PQ and HLG. I'll set that back to hue preservation. And then you can play around in here with the exposure and actually dial in the settings right there on the clip before you even touch the rest of the Lumetri color panel. And you can change how saturated those highlights are right there, and apply to all clips instances will apply to every instance of that clip. So in general, you probably want to have all of these turned on unless you know you have a specific reason to turn them off. Display color management, extended dynamic range monitoring, auto detect color log space, and auto tone map media. That's going to ensure you get the best possible representation of the true color and contrast of these clips when you bring them into Premiere Pro. All right, let's get back over here to the Lumetri panel, and I'll show you what all the different sections are about. I'm just going to park my playhead here on a shot from this short film where these two guys are talking here in the office. I just want to see a single shot of this gentleman right here as I explain the Lumetri panel. So I click on the clip like so, and right here at the top, you can see there's the option to do an input LUT. Now these are technical LUTs. A lot of times you get these from set, the DP or the camera assistant will do this in camera. They'll agree on the look, and then that LUT will come along with the footage. You can go to browse here at the top of the panel and just go ahead and navigate to where those LUTs are. And you notice that you can import things like a .cube or a .3DL. So different LUT formats are all supported. But as with all color correction, you don't have to use a LUT. In this case, we didn't start with one, so we'll just leave that at none. Now below this is this auto button. This is actually using a little bit of AI. Premiere is going to take a look at your footage and try to determine the best possible settings for it. So I'm going to click that, and right away you can see that it brightened things up, and all the sliders have moved on their own with that auto function. And you can see that it added some exposure, some contrast, and some highlights, kind of pushed everything up, didn't crush any shadows or anything like that. It doesn't make these big creative choices. It's just trying to find the best possible exposure and look on the shot here. And you can adjust the intensity of that automatic setting with this slider right here. So by moving it further over, it's going to increase all the settings that it added to the footage. Or if you go the opposite direction, it's going to pull them back down towards basically zero, no correction. Now, if you don't like this auto look, or you want to adjust these sliders on your own from scratch, that's totally fine. You can always just hit reset and everything will basically go back to zero. So the rest of the basic correction space here includes options for white balance. So I'll just pick a spot there, and you can see how it adjusts the temperature and the tints. There's a saturation slider right here. And then under light, we have options for things like exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, the amount of white or black you want to see in the shot. And again, anytime you get results that you're not happy with, you want to just reset everything to a baseline, just hit reset, and everything snaps back to the way it was before you touch the Lumetri panel. I'm just going to go ahead and keep that on auto for now. I thought that was a pretty good place to start. And then down here under creative, there's another place where we can put LUTs. Before this, we had the technical LUTs. These are the creative LUTs where you can actually give everything a look. And there is a browser here, and these are all the creative looks that are in Premiere Pro. I can pull up this Fuji option, for example. Now, this is the actual look browser right here. And what you can do is go through all of them one by one right here in this little browser, just by clicking on this right arrow here. And if you get to another look that you like, let's go back one. There we go. I want to apply this Kodak look instead of the Fuji look. Just double click and it automatically loads that LUT onto the footage. Now, if you want to add your own technical or creative LUTs to those drop-down menus, there are specific folders on your computer where you're going to want to place those LUT files. Look inside the class materials that accompany this lesson, and I'll show you the exact folder path that you need to follow in order to place those files correctly. Now, just like with the technical LUT, we have an intensity slider to change the effect of this creative LUT here, more or less intense. There's a faded film option, which basically kind of washes out the image if you're going for that type of look. There is a sharpener here, and you don't want to put in all the way to 100, but somewhere around here, if you want to just add a little bit of sharpness, if the edges don't quite feel crispy enough, you can push this a little bit here, or take it all the way down and actually add blur if you go into the negative side. Now, vibrance and saturation work in similar yet different ways. They're basically affecting the overall intensity of the color. Saturation just increases everything. And if you desaturate completely, obviously you will go to black and white. I'm just going to quickly set that back to 100. Now, vibrance is often called smart saturation, in that it looks at the overall shot and only attempts to intensify those colors that are muted. And in this case, it tends to favor kind of the blues and the greens and will not affect the reds and yellows as much. And because of that, it tends to be pretty good about not overdoing skin tones. So you see, by just pumping up the vibrance here, it's affecting the other parts of the shot and not his face. All right. And again, negative vibrance will just lead to black and white. So we're just going to push that up just a little bit. And then we have options here to push color into the shadows, so I can warm those up, make them redder. And I'm just clicking and holding as if this was a trackball interface here. So you click and hold, and you see the crosshairs move like so. I can do the same thing for the highlights. I can push those more towards green, for example. Now, the quick tip here to reset these, if you've already moved these balls a little bit, you want to put them back to where they were, just double click right here there in the center. You want to see that donut hole that tells you that you're basically back to 0. And then you can control the amount of tint that you've added to the shot with this balance option here below. It's sort of like another version of the intensity slider for the effect that you've applied here for the shadow and the highlights. All right. Now, some of you are used to working in curves. Those are available here in this curves drop down like so. You've got the main curve selection. By default, it's set to the luminance value, which is what you're seeing here. And when you scroll down over this line, you get the pen tool. You can add points and push them accordingly like so, or you can always move the beginning point or end point for the shadows or the highlights, or adjust the midtones like so. If you want to, again, reset any of these values, just double click in the empty space and all of your points will reset to 0 and the line will go back to the way it was. If you want to adjust individual curves, you use this selector here. So this is the overall luminance, but here I can select the red, the green, or the blue and just adjust that channel accordingly. I want to move those curves there, and again, double click to reset. Now, below the RGB curves are some interesting ways to manipulate color based on selection. I'm going to just go back up here to the main RGB curve, the luminance value here, and I'm just going to adjust the mid-tone of the shot and bring everything down just a little bit. And I'm going to play around with the color of his shirt. So here in hue versus saturation, we have eyedropper tool. I'm going to just select a patch of his shirt like so. You can see it makes a selection right here on this colored line. And I'm going to adjust that middle point here. And you see if I pull down, this is adjusting the saturation of the selection that I made, which is the blue. If I want to get more of the blue, in other words, get more of the shirt captured here, I can always pull this other point over here to the right. That captures the tones that are closer to purple. And in this case, I'll pull this one on the left over even more, which will capture any tones closer to cyan. Notice I'm only affecting the shirt. It's leaving the skin tones alone. I am catching a little bit of the background. Anything that basically falls into this blue area of color here is being affected. I can push the opposite way and I will oversaturate those blue colors, for example. And again, double click to reset. You also have hue versus hue, so you can use that option to actually change the color of something. I'm going to select the shirt, a little darker area this time. And as I pull up and down, notice I have a second axis of that color bar. And if I pull down, I'm pulling it more towards red and orange, for example. And if I pull up, I'm actually changing it to green. And it's affecting a lot of the shot there. If you want to not affect as much of the shot, then you actually pull these points in more and will affect less of the overall shot. You see there, it's actually not grabbing that section of the shirt as much. So I would have to add another point there. You can keep adding points that you want to adjust as well. Try to get everything to match up. It's really fun to play around with this. In this case, I can also affect the reds, which would affect his flesh tones. So you can achieve some pretty interesting effects. Again, double click to reset. Then hue versus luma, again, I'll select that shirt. That affects the overall luminance of that color. And you can see that I'm getting some pretty nasty results there. I need to be a little more selective in the color there to get the effect that I want. And a little bit goes a long way. There we go. It's pulling it down. Again, if you go too far, you're going to see some breakup in the image. In this case, I'll push up to increase the luminance there. I am getting some scattering up here in the ceiling. So there will be a different way to approach this that I'll show you in a moment. Let me reset that. Now we also have luma versus saturation. That allows you to adjust the saturation based on the tone rather than the hue, and then saturation versus saturation, which allows you to selectively manipulate areas of saturation in the image. Now this section here under color match is interesting. Now, this section below curves is called color wheels and match. This gives us additional options for manipulating the color based on shadows, midtones, and highlights. First of all, there are sliders next to each of those for manipulating those elements separately. So if I want to adjust just the shadows, pump them up, or in this case, crush them a little further, I can pull it down. Same thing with the midtones and the highlights. So I'm adjusting all those independently, and I can also put color selectively into those areas. I'll pump some red into those highlights, and I'll make the shadows even bluer here, for example. And once again, to reset anything, you just double click. So inside the color ball circles there, it makes the donut shape, and then just double click on the slider to reset that to 0 if you want. Now at the top of that panel here, we have the option to color match. This is for finding another shot on the sequence that you may want to apply the same overall color effect to this shot from. I can turn on comparison view with the button right here, and I'll find another shot in the sequence. I have a different type of clip parked in front of this one here, so I'll find another shot in that. It's an outdoor scene. There we go. That's kind of nice sunset shot there. I'm going to apply the overall kind of tone and color of this shot to this shot here, and I'm just going to hit apply match and see what happens. And there we go. We can see it's made some adjustments there in the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights, and it's touched a little bit of color each time. And you can experiment with this by turning face detection on or off as well and see what it does there, if it makes any difference. All right, so in this case, it found some warmth here in this shot and kind of added that into the flesh tones of our shot there. We can turn comparison view back off, and it looks pretty good. All right, now the next section of the panel is called HSL secondary. This allows you to do a secondary color correction on certain areas of the image on top of the correction that you've already done. Now what we're doing here is creating a key. We're going to create a mask key basically on his face using the flesh tones. And the way you preview that is flipping this color gray switch right here. This displays your selection versus a gray. So when you see nothing but gray, you have no selection made there. We'll turn that off very quickly here. You can use set color with the eyedroppers, or you can just choose these options here. So this is selecting all the reds, yellows, greens, and so forth. So if I turn on that preview option for color and gray now, if I chose the reds, I can see all the reds, the yellows, the greens, the cyans, blues, and so forth. So the color gray is a way of actually previewing the key that you're going to make. And what you want to do is, once you have a decent selection areas, you want to add to it. There's a few different ways to do that. You can try to use this plus dropper to increase your selection there. So I just added some to it. You can also use this dropper to try to remove things you don't want from the selection from this key. All right, that's getting there. Now these arrows on top of these triangles here, they can be moved to add a little bit more color and kind of refine the selection as well. So I'm just working within the hue here to get more of that skin selected up top. And I can do the same thing down here for saturation. Maybe I have too much selected, so I'll bring that back in, but I'll just add back to it like so, kind of bring that out. All right, I'm getting a pretty good amount of his skin there. I don't want his eyes, so that's fine. And this goes into the shadows a little bit more. There we go. Now, one tip here is that I often do HSL secondaries as a separate pass. I don't want to do this as part of this main color effect here, this main lumetri effect that I've applied, because I want to be able to actually mask this if I need to. This is selecting too much outside of his skin tones. I'm getting sections of the office over here. So I can apply a quick mask in my effects controls panel to get rid of that. But in order to do that, I need to separate this secondary color effect from the main color effect that I'm working on. Let me turn off that selection for now. I'm going to reset this panel just for a moment. And up here at the top where it says Lumetri Color, there's a drop down there where I can add a Lumetri Color effect. This is a second version of this effect stacked on top of the main Lumetri effect I've already applied. You can stack as many versions of this effect on top of itself that you want. I'm going to add a secondary Lumetri Color effect, and very quickly I want to rename it. And the option is also there to rename it. That way when I look at them in the effects stack, I can tell them apart. So I'm going to click rename, and I'm going to call this one Skin Pass. And now that is separate. If I go to effects controls, I actually can see both options there. I can see the main Lumetri effect that I applied, and then this version of the Lumetri effect that we just made, and that was renamed as Skin Pass. So they exist separately. And because each effect, most effects in Premiere Pro can be masked with these tools, I have the option now to mask out the Skin Pass. So I'm going to do that right now, and I'm just going to do a rough garbage mat around my actor here, like so. Great. So now everything I apply on this Lumetri pass is going to be within this mask, and I can always track it. I'm just going to do a quick scrub here, make sure that most of his skin falls within the mask. So a little further down, I'm going to need a little more space there. That looks pretty good. So that's going to allow me to just affect the skin tones right there within the mask. So now I'll go back up here to the Lumetri panel. Again, I want to make sure the right one is selected, so I see Skin Pass up there, not the other Lumetri effect, which is the main base effect here. So I click on Skin Pass. Now I'm going to select my reds. Let me hide that mask real quickly just by clicking off of it. Select my reds, turn on color gray. There we go. So now I'm getting that skin tone key that I saw earlier. I'm just going to try to isolate that better and get a little more of his skin there, like so. Pretty good. I'll try to use the plus side eyedropper to select a little bit more. That looks good there. Go back, get a little bit more in here. All right, that looks pretty good. I've gotten most of that skin. There's a little denoiser pass you can do here to try to remove some of that kind of crunchy noise that appears on the edges. And there is a blur option as well. You're going to want to add just a little bit of blur to this. Not a ton, but just a little bit to kind of clean up those rough edges. I'll give it 1.0. That way the line between the selection we made and the parts that are not selected won't be quite as stark. All right. Now you have other options, by the way. Instead of just the color gray preview, you can do color versus black, and you can also do a black and white version of the key just to see everything that you are selecting. And with that selected, I can see, yes, it is going to get this section of ear that was over on the other side of his face. And it's not going to catch much of this part of his flesh tones, but that's in the shadows anyway, so we're not going to notice much of that. Now below that is where we do the actual correction for this HSL secondary layer. We have one big color wheel we can use just to kind of push that in the direction we want, like so, and one big kind of Luma slider over here on the side to brighten or darken our selection. Now if you want to break that off into finer controls, you don't have to use one big wheel. You can click this button right here, and that breaks it out into 3 wheels for shadows, midtones, and highlights. And now you can be a little more selective in what you're going to do. We also have the temperature, tint, contrast, sharpen, and saturation controls, similar to what we had up here in the basic correction panel. So for temperature, I'm going to push his skin a little more warmer, like so. And I'll just see what happens if I remove some of that green. Actually, no, a little more pink in there will do him nicely. I'm going to increase the midtones just a little bit here to kind of open up that face. And same thing, just a little bit for the highlights as well. And I'm going to push the midtones a little warmer. That's too much. Go the other, just a little touch there. And pull a little warmth. And put some warmth as well into the highlights. And now that I've got it there, we increased. I can mess around with contrast. And I'm going to just decrease that saturation. You got a little bit too hot for me. So I'm just going to bring that saturation down a little bit. Now let's take a look at our work. I can very quickly A/B that. I'm just going to turn the checkbox next to HSL secondary on or off, like so. All right, a little bit of warmth there. It's catching a little bit of that background. I can refine that mask a little bit if I want to, but for now I think this looks pretty good as by way of example. All right, so that's how we use the HL secondary. And again, I prefer to use that in a second Lumetri pass. That way I can use masks if I need to, or I can just isolate that effect to a very small portion of the image, because a lot of times you select something like skin and there's some other color in the shot that's the same color of the skin or within the same tonal range, and you wind up color correcting that when you don't want to. So by adding the HSL secondary to a second Lumetri effect, you can use the mask tools to isolate that better. And finally, down here at the bottom, let me go back to the main Lumetri effect here, because that's where I might want to do a vignette. This is very simple. If you push negative, you will get the expected effect there on the edges. It will go darker. If you go positive, they will actually get lighter. So in this case, we're going to do that. And then by affecting things like the midpoint, you can increase the amount on the edges there, the roundness. You're basically affecting the shape of the vignette there, and you can feather it. And again, I'll A/B that effect like so. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn off this skin pass here, and I'll go back to the base level Lumetri effect. Now I can, again, turn off the effects badge to see before and after. I can also do that in comparison view. So I'll go back here to comparison view, and there's a switch down here in the bottom left, shot or frame comparison. So instead of comparing it to a different shot in the sequence, it compares it to itself, and then I can A/B it like so. Or I can do a split screen. So there's a vertical split option and a horizontal split option. And you can leave this on. So if you want to change it further, so I'll go turn my effects back on, and our basic correction there, I'm just going to do a little bump in exposure, and I can see the difference there between left and right. I'll go top and bottom. There we go. I'll warm it up a little bit. So there on the bottom, I can see the difference, and up top here is where we were. I can also do that vertically, or I can do them side by side. So that's just a way to compare the shot to itself as I'm making further corrections. And again, that's the switch down here in the bottom left of comparison view. Otherwise, it goes back to the selector where you can grab something else in the sequence. Now you can also stack Lumetri effects to do a variation on the idea of a power window. So we're going to isolate the subject of the shot and then reduce the background contrast and exposure to make him really pop there. So I'm looking at this shot here. I'm not really happy with the amount of exposure on this column here. It's a little bright. It's kind of pulling focus away from his face. So again, we can add even another layer here on top of our base Lumetri and the skin pass. I'm going to add another Lumetri color effect, and I'm going to rename that exposure. And for that one, I am going to bring the exposure down, and I'm just paying attention to that back wall there. I'm going to play with the contrast a little bit. Those highlights need to come down a lot. There we go. So I'm just going to bring those down like so. And again, we can go back to effects controls and find that Lumetri color effect. There we go. It's called exposure. I'm going to put that one on the top, and I'm going to make a quick garbage matte around my subject like so. And I'm going to invert that mask and feather the heck out of it. And there we go. So now I've really darkened that background, really made him pop. And I can reduce the overall opacity of that effect as well. By playing with the mask opacity here, if I think I've gone a little bit too far, too extreme, I can pull that back down like so. I'll A/B that. There we go. Just a nice little drop there. Now I could keep going with this shot here, maybe try to bring up some of the shadows here on the face. But for now, we've got a pretty good baseline. We've got some nice exposure and color happening here. I think the shirt looks pretty good. I've cleaned up the flesh tones, made those nice and rich, and brought down the exposure there in the background to keep our focus here on our main subject. Now, similar to Avid and other software, you have the ability to color correct the source clip in the project bins as opposed to just the clip on the timeline. And those changes to the source clip's color will ripple through all of your sequences wherever that clip is used. So here I have the coach, and instead of just color correcting this clip right here on the timeline and then copying, pasting that effect to the other examples of the same clip here, I'm going to color correct the source. So you see up here in Lumetri, we have two tabs up here at the top. We've been color correcting on the sequence side, but you can correct on the source side. And when I click on that, it automatically opens up the source clip here in the source viewer. And all these corrections are now going to take place on the source clip itself and not just this instance in the timeline. I'm just going to go to basic correction here and hit auto. And I'm just going to warm up the temperature slightly, just make some basic moves here. I'm going to play around with this contrast. And you see it's color correcting on the source side over there on the left as well. There we go. Now, a couple things to note. When you color correct on the source, or actually if you apply any effect on the source side of things, you'll notice that the FX badge gets this little red line underneath it. That visually tells you that there is something going on the source side with this clip, that there has been a source effect applied. And indeed, if I click on that clip and do a match frame, I can see in effects controls, there is the regular controls for this clip on the sequence side, but there's also a source effects tab here, and I can see that the Lumetri color has been applied. And because I've applied that on the source level, if I look at other clips in the timeline, they are all the same. That source effect has applied itself to all instances here because it's coming from the main clip in the bins and not just this clip in the sequence. If we alter anything, I'm just going to do a radical shift here. I'll just push the temperature way down. I'll go to blue. You can see that that also has changed all the instances. So if you're going to use a clip several times in several sequences, or it's a long form project and that clip is going to appear several times, just go ahead and color correct it at the source level as opposed to the sequence level. That way all your changes will make sure to ripple through every time you use that clip in a sequence. Now I'm going to push that clip back to its warmer self. That looks much better. Now, a quick note here, sometimes this happens, and I do this all the time myself. When you're color correcting and you mean to do it on the source side, let me go ahead and delete this effect here and go back to the way it was. You intend to color correct on the source side, but accidentally you color correct it on the sequence side at the clip level here and not at the source clip level. I'm just going to go back and hit auto again, push it warmer, and do that same kind of contrast move here. So I've accidentally done that just on this instance of the clip in the sequence. It has not affected the other clips. I meant to do that on the source side. Happens to me all the time, no problem. Just go into your effects controls, click on Lumetri color, and just cut it. Command or Control X in this case, just cut that and then immediately switch to the source effects tab and paste. And now you've got the source effect. So either do it that way or make sure that you have the source, the Lumetri applied on the source side here, or use the source tab over here as opposed to the sequence tab. But again, no problem. If you accidentally start color correcting it on the sequence, just copy paste that Lumetri into the source side. And obviously you can stack those up. So you can have a source side effect of Lumetri, but then also do a sequence side effect of Lumetri. And that's just a second instance of that where you can push things a lot further. So in this case, I'm going to just do a quick vignette on this clip, but that's only going to affect that clip there and not the rest. So you can stack Lumetri effects on both the source side and the sequence side if you want. That's it for working with color. Hopefully this overview has given you the confidence to start doing your own correction and grading right inside Premiere Pro. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.